Hello and welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson. This week, playing at ghosts. In mythic Europe, fairies are drawn to stories, and to transgressions of boundaries. In the real world, people like to play at being ghosts. How do these two ideas combine? Can pretending to be a ghost cause a haunting? I've recently listened to an episode of the Folklore podcast by Mark Norman, web address thefolklorepodcast.weebly.com, in which he interviewed Dr. David Waldron of the Federation University of Australia. Dr. Waldron studies folk history around the Australian goldfields, and in this episode he discussed playing the ghost, the rash of hoaxes in the late 19th century. Many hoaxes are quite elaborate productions, but some were simple affairs taking advantage of new and toxic luminescent paint. Victoria, in Australia, was a hive of headless horsemen, glowing animals, and people in sheets. Often the goal was simply to give people, in general or particular, a scare. In mythic Europe, some fairies feed on fear and may pick up the role. Other motives included crime, robbery, assault, rape. These things also attract fairies. Rebellion against the ruling class, and on a less material level, the release of psychological pressures by transgressing social norms. Dr. Waldron tells some lovely stories of laying the ghost, the tradition of vigilantes seeking out hoaxes to mete out frontier justice. This was a sport, and avoiding hunters was part of the charm of the game for some of the hoaxers. There are many types of fairy that want to be pursued. The following section of the podcast is a LibriVox public domain recording from Gossip in the First Decade of Victoria's Reign by John Ashton, recorded by David Wales. It concerns the character of Spring-Heeled Jack, and you can see that as the story develops, Jack develops greater powers. His story escalates from costumes to stage tricks and then to supernatural abilities. This may indicate a fairy taking up a role once it has been established by hoaxers. So now, with thanks again, over to David Wales.
In the Mansion House Police Court on 10 January, the Lord Mayor announced that he had received 5 letters relative to an individual who was going about the metropolitan suburbs frightening females to such an extent that they were afraid to go out at night, as they were met by a man who, under different disguises, would suddenly appear before them, and as suddenly disappear with terrible bounds, which earned him the name of Spring-Heeled Jack, and he inspired such terror that the recital of the victim had to be taken with caution. Whoever he was, or why he so acted, was never known, as he was never taken. But certainly robbery had no part in his escapades, for he was quite content with paralyzing the poor women with fright. The first facts I can gather about Jack are at the latter end of 1837, at Barnes, where he appeared as a large white bull. At East Sheen he was a white bear. He then visited Richmond, and after having terrorized that town, he went to Ham, Kingston, and Hampton, where he was clad in brass armour with large claw-like gloves. Teddington, Twickenham, and Hounslow were all visited by him, and at Ilsworth we hear of him wearing steel armour, in which he seems to have been attired when seen at Uxbridge, Hanwell, Brentford, and Ealing. At Hammersmith he took the form of a huge baboon, and as such was seen in the moonlight dancing at Kensington Palace, over and anon climbing over the forcing houses. He varied his localities frequently, one day being at Peckham, another at St. John's Wood, and anon at Forest Hill. This about brings up to the time of its being mentioned by the Lord Mayor, the consequence of which was that a committee was formed at the Mansion House for the purpose of receiving subscriptions and deciding upon the best means of capturing this erratic genius. Probably feeling that he had sufficiently terrorized the districts before mentioned, he turned his attention to the East End of London, and particularly favoured Bow. A case is given in the Times of 23 February. A gentleman named Alsop, living between Bow and Old Ford, appeared before the police magistrate at Lambeth Street, then the Thames Police Office. accompanied by his 3 daughters, one of whom stated that at about 8:45 on the evening of the 21st February, 1838, she heard a violent ringing at the front gate of the house, and on going to the door to see what was the cause, she saw a man standing outside, of whom she inquired what was the matter. The person instantly replied that he was a policeman, and said, "For God's sake, bring me a light, for we have caught Spring-heeled Jack here in the lane." She returned to the house, and brought a candle, and handed it to the man, who was enveloped in a large cloak. The instant she had done so, he threw off his outer garments, and, applying the lighted candle to his breast, presented a most hideous and frightful appearance, vomiting forth a quantity of blue and white flame from his mouth, his eyes resembling red balls of fire. From the hasty glance which her fright enabled her to get at his person, she observed that he wore a large helmet, and his dress, which appeared to fit him very tightly, seemed to her to resemble white oilskin. Without uttering a sentence, he darted at her, and, catching her partly by her dress and the back part of her neck, placed her head under one of his arms, and commenced tearing her clothes with his claws, which she was certain were made of some metallic substance. She screamed out as loud as she could for assistance, and by considerable exertion got away from him, and ran towards the house to get in. Her assailant followed, and caught her on the doorstep, when he again used considerable violence, tore her neck and arms with his claws, as well as a quantity of hair from her head. Her story was fully corroborated by her parents and sisters, and her injuries, which were very considerable, bore unmistakable testimony to the truth of the assault. At the same police court, on 8 March, 1838, a Miss Scales deposed that as she and her sister were walking in Limehouse, about 8:30 in the evening, on coming to Green Dragon Alley, they observed some person standing in an angle in the passage. She was in advance of her sister at the time, and just as she came up to the person, who was enveloped in a large cloak, he spirted a quantity of blue flame right in her face, which deprived her of sight, and so alarmed her that she instantly dropped to the ground, and was seized with violent fits, which continued for several hours. In this case, no violence to the person was done. He had a literature of his own. I know of 3 pamphlets on the subject, one from which is taken the accompanying illustration, is entitled "Authentic Particulars of the Awful Appearance of the London Monster, alias Spring-heeled Jack, together with his extraordinary life, wonderful adventures, and secret amours. Also an account of his horrible appearance to Miss N, and his singular letter to the Lord Mayor of London." There is much more to be related of Jack, but space will not permit. But whether too much attention was beginning to be paid to him with a view to his capture, or whether his love of mischief had died out, cannot be told. But certain it was that nothing was known publicly of this singular being after April, 1838, having kept London in a ferment of excitement and terror for about 6 months.
Time for some story hooks. Laying the ghost. A merchant's daughter has been groped by the son of a nobleman pretending to be a ghost. The merchant wants revenge, but the difference in social standing makes this difficult. He'd like the player characters to arrange an accident, not necessarily fatal, but enough to encourage a more pious life. This isn't mentioned in the show notes, but one of the things I've been trying to do an episode about is an Italian legal case where a man murders a person coming back from a party or a celebration or a travelling show who is dressed as the devil. His defence was he actually thought it was the devil, and so when he attacked it, he thought he was doing a pious act, and he's let off, because in mythic Europe, the idea that you might see a demon wandering around late at night is perfectly plausible, and so a man dressing as a demon and wandering around drunkenly late at night is getting what he's asking for. But on to the next plot hook. Protecting the brand. A group of young noblemen have all been acting the ghost, but one of them is taking things too far and is attacking people. One of the others approaches the Magi and asks for a favour. Can they discover which one is responsible and rein him in? Next story hook. A murderous fairy has appeared, taking on the role of a ghost that was created for play by a group of noble lads. It has sufficient cognizance to know that its role might be changed by humans playing the role, so it started murdering them in private. The player characters are contracted to defeat the fairy, before it kills again. Breaking the guilty. The player characters have discovered a dark secret from an enemy but can't use it publicly. Could they instead use a faux ghost to trick the enemy into confirming the truth of the information that they have uncovered? Last plot hook. This has been going on for a while. A line of vigilantes has been acting the ghost for generations in a nearby city, but one of the magic items they've been using has been damaged and needs replacement. The current vigilante contacts the player characters to buy new gear, and is surprised that they do not know that the originals were provided by one of their predecessors in the Covenant. Do the player characters care that one of the elders of their Covenant was selling magic items on the sly? Do they tidy up after him by finding his other scattered wares? Do they want to find his lab notes and create a league of superheroes? In the show notes, there are stats for a version of Spring Hill Jack that has him as a Mike 20 fairy. I won't try and read them into audio because stat blocks don't suit this format. Thanks again to David Wells and LibriVox for recording that snippet into the public domain.